What's up, fellow nerds? Phreak here, and patch 9.12's notes have come out, so let's talk about them. As always, it takes a week and roughly a day for any given patch to hit pro play, so this weekend's LCS and LEC game is not going to be on this one, but reading through it, it's small in number of things hit, but I think pretty big in impact. Quick disclaimer, I don't have solo queue win rates at my fingertips right now, so I'll be speaking to pro presence and how big I think these changes are. All right, so 9.12 is coming out. Do want to point out that this is, as of now, never mind. 9.12 is coming out. That's what matters. There's some cool skins. These look pretty sweet. The Mordekaiser rework is coming out. That looks pretty sick. That's going to be an exciting thing to look for. Cool stuff there. Last week they put out an article about how they view numerical balance in terms of when things are force nerfed and force buffed when they fall out of line. I think that's actually pretty cool, worth reading. There's a link there. Go to the patch notes, click the link. It's a good read. Great. Next up, Mordekaiser's old icon getting reworked. Gameplay preview didn't really have a full spotlight. It was more just like, here's what the abilities do by. Such as it is, I haven't been a producer on Champion Spotlight in a very, very long time. So I haven't really super talked to people about why that's the case, that spotlights are kind of scaled back. There is one for Kiana, FYI, so whenever that comes out. Anyway, let's move on to the 7th or whatever Rise rework. So this is pretty big. Let's go through them all. And essentially Rise is the problem of, and has for a very long time had the problem of, is great in pro, is not great in solo queue. And so they want to essentially reshape the champion. So let's talk about what's happening with Rise. Okay, his base mana is down by 100. His mana regen is up by 2 mana per 5 seconds. So here's that data table. Old mana was 400 to 1250, now it's 300 to 1150. This is actually very, very high stat scaling. Generally speaking, you don't tend to reach 1,000 mana as a mid lane mage. Rise does. So this is generally on the high side. This nerf is 25 to 8%, not gigantic. Here's the mana regen difference. As always, I do mana regen per minute because I think the numbers are large enough to digest properly. And essentially, it takes 4 minutes to regen his lost mana. So if you buy other regen items, like if you for some reason get Athene's or something silly, or a Chalice into Mikhail's, then I guess, your regen's different there. But that's not really typical. What really happens is you have, Lost Chapter regen, or blue buff is percent max mana. So there's actually a lot of other factors that actually further nerf the mana that matters. Also, Rise gets free mana based on his max mana via his passive, and that also nerfs this. So while it would take you 4 minutes to regen this, and that is, I think, a reasonable timer to be roughly balanced, essentially this is a nerf. Okay, next thing, Overload has 5 ranks instead of 6. The damage is shifted. It no longer shields him after consuming 2 runes, but does still give the bonus movement speed after consuming 2 runes. So if you EWQ, you run fast, you do not get a shield. Or if you EEQ, you run fast but don't get a shield. The haste is pretty similar. 25 to 40 becomes 20 to 40. Essentially, by old rank 5 to new rank 5, it's slightly faster, but I guess old to new rank 4 is slightly faster as well. Ultimately, though, this is essentially a wash. I didn't bother data tabling this because it's not a big enough deal. What does matter is the damage is different. The shield is gone. That's just an objective nerf, of course. And the spell damage bonus is not based on E rank, but on R rank, and actually starts at 10% at the very beginning of the game. Okay, so what does that look like? Okay, well, here's the base damage on the Q before and after, right? 60 to 185 becomes 80 to 180. It is better until level 11 when the old rank 5 came in. So right off the bat, bam, just WQing someone, fwap, or doing things like EWQ is strictly more damage for the first 10 levels of the game. Strictly, it just is. It's just always better. Okay, so that's really relevant and non-trivially so, right? This is straight up 20 more damage always until final rank. Okay, so this is a pretty big deal. Also keep in mind that this is not only just trading champions, but if you like spread spell flux on things, then Q, right, your empowered Q, which is going to be over here, that's how that damage deals. Okay, so what about the spell flux modification? Now, of course, at level 1, you of course can't do this, so it's still 60 and 80, but essentially, if you are basically, the more base damage the ability has, the more the spell flux modifier matters. So at level 2, if you EQ someone slightly higher, essentially these numbers are very close to the same. Right, you're within about 5 to 10% most of the time, so it's basically a wash. The EQ changes are essentially the same. There's not going to make a big difference regardless. Just, yeah, straight up, whatever. There's like a small trough here at levels like 13 through 15, but like, it's fine. It's basically the same. Okay, so EQ is the same. Flat Q is better for the first 10 levels, then down by 5 damage, who cares from then on. Technically, the AP ratio attached to Q scales slightly differently based on the ranks here. It's not a big enough deal to matter, honestly. And again, yeah, it's slightly weaker from 13 onwards, but better from 16 onwards. Okay, so that's the Q change basically, right? This is generally speaking going to be a buff. This is generally speaking power neutral. So okay, so Rise Q slightly stronger is what this change means, except for the shield is gone. Okay, so less damage via mana. The regen lets you spam as much, but you still have less damage because you have mana ratios. Overload is basically the same ability / slightly stronger early game, but doesn't have a shield. Okay, so far we're on the same page. Rune Prison now has 4 times the bonus mana ratio. Now, I could not come up with a pretty reliable way to do the math for this. It was like, oh, if you have no items and runes and only a Seraph's, and it's like, it just wasn't worth it for me. This is going to be some level of bonus damage. Keep in mind, if you have, let's say, a Seraph's Embrace, and it's, 1,250 bonus mana, then that's 120, 12.5 damage is 1%. So this is like 37 more damage with Seraphs. The more AP you have, the more bonus mana you get, so it's, more than that, but, essentially non-trivial. By mid-game, you're looking at 40, 50, 60, in a late game, maybe even almost 100 bonus, probably not 100 bonus damage, but pretty substantial. This actually is pretty meaningful in terms of actual damage output there. The cost gets stretched, lower at rank 1, higher at max rank. I actually did not do any of the W math. Okay, yeah, that's kind of my bad, I guess. It doesn't really matter, though. The mana cost is down by 10 until level, 14, and then it's still down, and then at 15 it's the same, and then at 17 and 18 it's higher. It's really whatever. This is not all that meaningful. It's basically just cheaper and does more damage, so okay, whatever. Helps make up for the fact that with this mana going down, your overall damage is slightly lower. But the big change is this. The Empowered W is still a 1.5 second root. That's not changed at all. But the Unempowered W is a 1.5 second, 35% slow instead of a 3/4 second root. This is a nerf. Strictly a nerf. Not only do slows not stack at all, the highest single slow takes effect. So if, Jarvan presses W near your target, Rune Prison literally doesn't crowd control. Essentially is what that comes down to. Yeah, this is a really big change. This is really, really, really substantial. So this is a very, very much a nerf. Very, very much a nerf. This is a pretty big deal. Again, EW is the same. This damage bump does matter. Arguably, his overall damage is slightly higher as a result of all these changes so far. Let's move on to the next one. Spell Flux actually loses 10 damage. The cost is cheaper, though, in the early game. And the bounces always bounce, though. So now you are always able to bounce into your Q. That's a pretty big deal. You can always bounce into your Q for the wave clear. Now, you don't deal spell flux damage anymore on anything but your primary target, so that's going to be a thing, where the E doesn't wave clear, but you can EQ, 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 and that's how you're going to wave clear stuff. That's going to be a pretty big difference, but keep in mind that because you're not spamming E as much, well, it's got a lower, or it's not as useful. You have to spam it to set up your wave clear and all this stuff. Lower mana cost. So I hope it does math right. Yeah, so the base damage is down by 10. Okay, 14 to 7% there. The cost is pretty substantially cheaper, though, so overall this is fine. And again, we have this table up here where the empowered Q damage is about the same overall. Also, one thing I want to point out is E's rank up. E's actual ability rank up is a quarter second of cooldown. It goes from I think 3.5 to 2.5, something like that. Roughly that kind of scaling. Whereas Rune Prison scaling is 1 full second per rank. With this always bouncing and not damaging anything else, the only thing it gives you is a 15 mana cost, a 20 base damage on only your primary target, and a quarter second cooldown. There's a chance you leave Spell Flux at rank 1 now. There's a real good chance, because you don't need to rank it up for the Q, because it doesn't damage other minions, you very well might keep Spell Flux at rank 1. And I only realized this now. I didn't really put the thought process when I built this out last night. There's a really good chance Spell Flux is a 1-point wonder, and you're going to max W second. And you're going to have this slow up a lot more often. And with the bonus mana ratio going up there, there's a real good chance this is there. If this does happen, though, keep in mind that Spell Flux is going to have a longer cooldown to the tune of about 30%. Because, again, the cooldown goes from about 3.5 to 2.5, and if it stays at 3.5 the entire game, that is a lot less Spell Flux overload combos that you are getting off in your laning phase. So that is a big thing to kind of keep in mind. Ability order might change quite a lot. Next up is Realm Warp, which now gets 3 ranks. As we mentioned before, overload bonus damage is now going to scale with R rank. Nice little usability thing. It automatically casts at max rank when you cast it beyond the border. Minimum cast range going up means you can't short hop as much, which I don't think means all that much all that often. I know there are some usability gains with this, but it's not that big of a deal. The bigger thing is that rank 1 is more usable, and there is now a rank 3 with a shorter cooldown. So here is this data table. This is range before and after, and this is cooldown before and after. Obviously, range substantially buffed. The cooldown not nerfed enough for this not to be a strict buff. So remember, Overlord's better, ranks levels 1 through 10. And Realm Warp, there we go, is better, ranks 1 through 10, or levels 1 through 10. And then it's the exact same ability, 11 through 15, and it is strictly better at 16 plus. So this is just inarguably power up. Now, there's 2 things I want to say about this, just sort of design-wise. One, I think this is a good change, just design-wise. I actually really, really dislike when things change in duration and things change in range with rank. Because I think it's actually very important that just for learnability and usability, that things feel a bit consistent. Now, damage can go up. You can have ratios change, like slow potency, I think, is totally reasonable to change. I dislike when crowd control duration changes or buff duration changes, and I dislike when ranges change, because it's just harder to completely understand exactly how useful something is. So I think this is really useful. The other one is Realm Warp. The other sort of side of it is that Realm Warp is a very pro-heavy skill. It's very much about what's the phrasing? It's hard for noobs to use Realm Warp, or just like your general solo queue player to use Realm Warp well. It is a very skill-testing ability. And so with rank 1 being, I would say, objectively stronger in basically all cases, pros are going to get a lot more out of that level 6 through 10 rise than regular players are. So this change is a pro-helping change, I would say. All in all, lots of changes are happening here. Overload is essentially the same ability minus the shield. That's a nerf. This is a nerf. This is a nerf. This is a nerf. This is a pro-facing buff. Now, I think it's completely reasonable to say that a lot of the nerfs on this character nerf pro more, and a lot of the usability changes help non-pro. Like, E always bouncing helps non-pro a lot. Your W being a better damage tool, just like belt out damage and just press it in your trades, that helps non-pro, I would say, more than pro and whatnot. I think there's generally a fair bit that is shortening the gap in this set of changes. I think, you know, not having to have as much gameplay around the double rune into doing things gameplay. A lot of these things nerf pro more than they nerf solo queue. I think Rise definitely goes down in priority in pro. I think his win rate, definitely goes down in solo queue. And from there, they're going to build Rise back up. That's my read on these changes. It's hard to know for sure, but that's what I think is happening. Next up, big changes to Silas. Okay, so the changes to Silas. Another champion that is a low solo queue win rate champion and pretty much a mandatory first pick in pro according to most players. Pretty big changes here. So Silas can store 2 passive charges, which is pretty cool. It does more base damage, and it deals a lot less damage to minions. So I'm not doing anything about this. This is, I think you can kind of intuit just by yourself how much that matters. But here is how much damage Silas passive deals. Silas passive always deals his total attack damage plus this bonus damage. I'm not including the AP ratio. The AP ratio shouldn't change. Who cares? The base damage of the ability is up 4 to 12 damage, 6 to 8%. He doesn't typically buy attack damage anywhere in his build, so this is going to pretty much just remain true forever. We don't really see Gunblade Silas. Okay, easy enough. Sure, it's slightly stronger, whatever, right? Like, this number looks bigger on paper than it is in real life because this is the actual change. It exists, it's there, no one cares. It does help his trading. Like, if you actually fight someone 1v1, he's going to do this, 6 to 12 bonus damage, but it's generally whatever. The big change is that it deals about 1/3 the damage to minions. So even though it did get slightly higher base damage, it deals 70% less to minions. His wave clear got clapped. It got clapped. This is massive wave clear down. I can only hope that this is a slightly misleading patch note and that you don't actually deal reduced damage to your primary target when you auto them. I'm assuming this was QA'd properly. I actually have high faith in our QA. I think our QA is quite good. So I trust this is not affecting your single target damage when you auto attack a thing, that you at least do your base attack damage to it. But, theoretically possible. Doubt it, though. Doubt it's wrong. Doubt it's wrong. All right, next thing up. So that thing happens. The Chain Lash detonation damage on Q2 does 5 to 25 less damage with a 0.2 lower AP ratio. Now, the second half of Q used to do the full base damage of Q1. Now it does less on Q2. Also, the range that it has against minions, there were actually separate ranges between champions and minions. That has been truncated. I believe now these are the same range for minions and champions. Essentially, this is another wave clear nerf. Okay, well, here's Q1 plus Q2 before and after. Again, the total damage before was this. Now it's this, which is a 6 to 9% decrease. 6 to 9. The AP ratio overall is 0.2 lower to 17%. Okay, there you go. And now how about the minion overall damage? And it is this. It does 12% less damage overall. I think this is actually... This is the minion AP ratio. Yeah. This is not the minion base damage. For some reason, I just didn't include that column. I don't know why, but I didn't. So this is the minion AP ratio. In the real, right, so much like the normal AP ratio is 83%, and now it's 88%, the real world minion nerf is not as big as this data table, as this column. It's slightly less because Q2 already deals about half damage to minions, so nerfs to Q2 don't affect minions as much. Whatever, I guess they wanted to nerf his PvP damage more with this. Essentially, losing 5 to 25 damage on this is pretty close to how much damage you're getting on Petricite Burst. So if they're just saying, hey, you know what, instead of landing your Q on champions, you should be autoing them more, this is going to trade pretty equally. That's going to be a fairly similar amount of damage, the AP ratio notwithstanding. Honestly, whatever, it's a small touch. Next up is Kingslayer is getting just a flat 10 more heal and a flat 0.1 more AP ratio. There is that. It's assuming you're still going to max W last, which I think is still probably true. This is your difference, 17% more damage, 25% more ratio for most of the game. That actually scales down to less when you max out more points in the ability. Okay, that's obviously a strict buff. Next, we have the E, where the shield got moved from E1 and it got moved to E2. The cooldown rank incentive got lower, so it's going to make him less escapable. I want to point out that Silas normally maxes E second. That is his best build. And of course, that meant that he got a 10-second cooldown dash, which is a pretty big deal. Now it's a 40-second dash. I think he will still max E second, especially with the flat 10 increase on the W. There is still not a big incentive to max W. The difference in healing, yes, it's still 80 more health, but in general, I'm going to say not worth. It's closer with this, but I think it's still correct to max E second. So let's make the comparison. So the cooldown before and after, of course, first 7 levels, the same ability. Afterwards, pretty substantially worse cooldown. The shielding is up 20 to 40, and that is why I think you still max the shield second. Now, it does require you hit E2. It requires you actually hit the opponent, you land the skill shot, you go in on them. That's going to be hard to do. On enemy champion or monster, by the way. So you can't even go and hit a minion with it. You actually got to land the all-in. This is really substantial. This is a very, very big change, and I think more so than the passive change, more so than the Q change, more so than the W change. This is a very, very, very big deal. This really erodes a lot on his safety. His safety, I would say, is a lot of why he is big in Pro. The wave clear matters, don't get me wrong, but this is a very big change. This is going to do a lot. This is going to do a lot to kick him out of Pro. He might actually be gone from Pro. I'm not sure if that's really true, but it's going to do a lot of legwork here. This is a very, very big change. I think this champion will ultimately end up underpowered. He'll need some buffs back up. We'll see what those are in the future, but he was almost certainly going to end up in a spot where he's too low win rate across pretty much everywhere, and he'll get buffs. Next up, some buffs and nerfs to Yuumi. This is another champion where they have to close the pro solo queue gap. Yuumi is basically 100% presence in most pro regions and has pretty much remained like a 46% win rate solo queue champion. She's going to have some kind of growth over time, but her growth is mostly stabilized, and last I saw was still fairly low win rate. So base stats are always very easy buffs that tend to help champions in solo queue more so than pro. Also keep in mind that Yuumi's a champion that sits untargetable for most of the game, so this is not as big of a deal for someone like Yuumi as it would be for, like, say, Rakan. So, okay, health is up slightly. Cool. 11 to 3%, mostly in the early game. Keep in mind, supports don't level all that much. Most of your games, like, you end at level 11 or something, so pretty meaningful health increase. Okay, that's useful. Next up, nerfs to the passive. The mana refund is down 10 to 0. The shield is down 0 to 60, and 0.1 of the AP ratio. Here is the mana restore before and after. I'm assuming in linear scaling because the old one's linear scaling. Pretty meaningful, honestly. You still have like a 5 mana restore difference in mid levels, so this matters a fair bit here. As far as the shielding, the old one had kind of strange scaling onto it. It sort of just, it was like +5 per level, then +10, then +15, then +25. So I just kind of guessed what the new scaling would be. I don't know what it actually is. I assumed it was going to be identical until it started going to +25 or whatever, and just like picked numbers. This is not going to be exactly accurate, but it'll be close to accurate. It's basically this kind of a nerf. Again, it's the same shield at level 1. It eventually means a lot more at level, as you go towards level 18. It's not a nerf at only 18. It'll matter before then as well. The AP ratio down 25%. Pretty meaningful. So yeah, definitely doing less shielding. And this is a nerf mostly, I would say, especially in the late game, to good Yuumis. Who know how to hop out, land the auto attack, get the shield, come back in. This is a more pro-facing and expert-facing nerf than it is newbie-facing. So there's that. That's a good bug fix. Here's some extra assist markers, and there is an update on how the adaptive force is shared. Basically, you get less percentage, 5 to 21, becomes 4 to 16, but you get 5 to 13 flat. That's actually pretty big. Now, again, the numbers are not that large, but this is the table here, right? Instead of 5 to, and you're supposed to max this last, of course. Instead of getting this, you get this. And it is only weaker if you're sort of glommed onto target has more than these many stats. 500 AP or, 300 attack damage? I think it's 0.6 is the ratio. So generally speaking, you're not going to hit this for a while. Now, this is 5 plus, 4% of 50 is 2. So it's 5 plus 2 instead of 3. It's like, well, I have 4 more AP until, later. These numbers look big. There's not a very big difference is what it comes down to. It flattens it slightly. It's still hard to have a 500 AP champion in the mid game, I would say, or 300 attack damage champion in the mid game. So this is generally speaking just, I would say, a strict buff on the ability for a very, very long time. But it's also a very small strict buff. Don't be misled. This is a very small buff. More quality of life stuff. Cool. Next up is a round of buffs and nerfs for champions that were under or overperforming. So yeah, Aatrox, another one of those first pick or ban champions in pro play. Really, really big deal, this character. Some things to care about. Your R no longer heals from ally healing. So if someone summoner heals you or redemptions you or is Soraka or has Athenes or whatever, that definitely can matter. This is a nice one. I think it's just a clean change. It's not going to change all that much, honestly. I think the vast majority of games, Aatrox is not benefiting meaningfully from ally healing, but this can matter at some point down the line. So, okay, that's kind of nice. The big change is, of course, this one. I am assuming there's a linear scaling at Deathbringer stance. That's frequently not the case, but in case it is, here you go. Really meaningful. Level 14 is the break even. That's going to take a long time to get to. Obvious nerf to Aatrox. This nerfs his trading and it nerfs his healing as well. Want to point out that keep in mind he has flat cooldown resets on this ability by landing Qs and auto attacks. So, let's say you refreshed it by like 5 seconds per cooldown. Instead of being 15 to 24, it's 10 to 19, which is arguably an even larger nerf. So this nerf in the real world, this percentage is actually higher. It is more distinct. And of course, in the later game, when it's only 12 seconds, it's up like freaking constantly. Overall, these both end up being nerfs to the champion. I don't think they knock him out of pro. I think he's probably the only guaranteed first pick in pro after these changes, which means he's going to be nerfed every single game by red side. Because I think these nerfs were smaller than everyone else's. 1 second cooldown off of Ash W. Here you go. Okay. Next change, Caitlyn gets 2 attack damage on a very similar front. There you go. Cool. Next up is Aurelia, who's getting some pretty more meaningful nerfs. So she's getting 4 to 2 seconds increased on her E and 75 range cut off the ability as well. So here's that data table. This is definitely meaningful. A couple things to point out is Aurelia's E is often used when she's in a bad matchup or her lane is in a bad state. She last hits with this ability. She can now do this less, especially when the first 7 levels, I would argue, are the hardest part for this champion. In case of not having your half of your wit's end or your phage or whatever done yet. So this actually definitely nerfs her early laning phase. One thing I want to point out is there was a tentative balance change that you actually might have seen on the Twitter wall that got put up for like the fall of the life of the patch. And it was the designer was considering nerfing Aurelia's base MR to make her less good in mid lane, to make her not as good into mages. There was some pushback saying, hey, it's weird to have be the only champion with awkward MR. Don't like that change. Then I ran and did a bunch of numbers, and turns out that Aurelia has very high health and slightly below average armor for her class. And so you could have actually done a magic damage durability pass on Aurelia by making her base stats Renekton's instead of Aurelia's. Essentially, Aurelia's a very high HP champion with mediocre armor, and then standard melee champion magic resist. So it means that when you're seeing all these Wits End Aurelias, it's better on her than most other champions because she has exceptionally high health, or at least exceptionally high health scaling. Her base HP is reasonable for melee. And she has generally a little bit low to okay-ish armor for her class. So Wits End is very efficient because of her high HP pool, is what it comes down to. So hey, FYI, there's a thing. So, if they ever do want to further nerf Aurelia and make her weaker against mages, buff her armor, lower her health. And I explained this to designers, hey, by the way, here, if you want to do that thing in a different way, there you go. And he's like, okay, thanks. Next one to do base stats, I'll hit you up. But the E nerf, I think, is completely fine. The range nerf is going to matter as well. You'll fish for less stuns easily, which is probably a positive. Next up are buffs to Karma. Now, what's interesting is we're starting to see Karma in pro play right now. Enchanters are coming back. So, interesting time to buff Karma because though she is definitely weak in solo queue, we're starting to see her a little bit in pro play. So, maybe Karma takes over. and is the ubiquitous pro play support. Who knows? We'll see. I doubt it. I think these these buffs are too small for like her to become the #1 support. Like these buffs are small enough that if she is the #1 support next patch, people are freaking trolling. Because like this is not a big enough change. This is nice, but it's not a big enough deal. So here's the Karma E changes. The cost is down by 10, so here you go. That's kind of nice. The highest win rate and most common solo queue build for this champion is maxing E second. It is Q first, so probably remains the major build. Her shield scaling, like the amount of shielding on rank up, did get hit pretty hard, so doesn't max at first that much anymore. And as far as the movement speed, basically, the movement speed percent already scales with rank. The duration is now a flat 2 instead of 1.5. So this is basically the how much of your move speed do you get to travel during the buff, basically. So you used to move 60% of your movement speed as bonus distance over the 1.5 seconds. Now you move your extra movement speed as extra distance. Now this is before diminishing returns, so in the real world it's not quite this good. But if you were slowed, it would, double you appropriately. So essentially it is, because of course it is, 2/3 more movement, because guess what this is. But it was kind of fun to just kind of point out exactly how much she moves you, and the fact that her haste scaling is actually pretty good. The haste gets 50% better than the rank 1 value, which is pretty meaningful. Yeah, you hit diminishing return, so it's not that in the real world in most cases, but a meaningful haste comes out of this ability. Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. I think you still don't have a reason to max it first. I think you should probably still, at least 3 points Q before you transition. And then, okay, when you're a level 7 Karma and you're out of lane, maybe you just don't care about Q poke anymore, and that's probably the right way to go about things. But, there's that. And then, yeah, she has better chase down and peel with her Q, which is a positive, of course. Next up is Lulu. She has not only particle updates, which is pretty cool, but she's got 10 more on the shield and a pretty nice 0 to 20 less mana cost. Now, Lulu does indeed max E first. That is her best build, so here you go. The cost kicks in meaningfully very quickly. Your main ability not having a higher mana cost. Pretty big deal for supports, as it turns out. The actual shielding being 10 higher is just nice overall. 220, still a pretty solid shield. So yeah, pretty meaningful stuff there. That's a positive. Otherwise, some more VFX updates, which is pretty cool. Love it. Bug fix for Master Yi, where his passive works a little bit better. That's cool. I didn't run this math because I forgot. 20 damage off rank 1 Q, though, is definitely pretty meaningful. Last I looked, which was a while ago, it was not this patch. E max first, I think, was still the correct Nautilus build. This slightly incentivizes you to max Q because the damage scaling is better. You're getting 5 more damage per point than before. Ultimately, I think Nautilus is a big deal as a champion. Very, very powerful, very meaningful character. Does need the nerfs. Good to see it overall. It's not a huge deal. It's not really going to change pro perception much, but it's going to be a slight win rank nerf in solo queue. Next up, a pretty meaningful buff to Zack's W. You indeed max this second. I chose Zack's own health as the target dummy for this. If you don't remember, Zack's W has a base damage plus a percentage of its target's max HP. Max or current? I forget. I think it's max. I could be trolling. Either way, percentage of its target's HP. And the percentage scales with rank. Now you max W second, so here's the data, the damage. Here's the data table. Of course, it's a flat 10 damage in all cases, but the damage really kicks up when you scale up to level 7 through 13 when you put the points in. And the 15 damage per rank up is nice, but the 1% more of a champion's max HP when they have, let's say, 1,000 health is also 10 damage per rank up. And so this thing scales massively to, high level champion, right? Like has a 200 to 250 base damage W on a very short cooldown. It is quite meaningful. Ultimately, as you can kind of see here, it's a bigger buff in the early game, especially when you're fighting things like the small raptors. Pretty big damage bump there, so it's a jungle clear buff for sure. And his late game's already pretty solid, to be honest. Knockback distance gets consolidated somewhat. And now instead of each champion spawns a chunk the first time they hit by a bounce, it's each bounce that hits one champion or more spawns a chunk. So better chunk spawning basically. Although arguably if you're like first R hit like 3 champs, it would have been 3 chunks and then none. Now it would be 1 per bounce. It's a reshape. I don't think it's that big of a deal. I don't think it changes that much. Nor does this. It's more of a consistency to, I think, how old Zach used to work. But this is pretty meaningful. This is going to be a pretty big buff to the champion. I know I saw Medios tweeting about how Zach's early game doesn't seem to be good enough to be playable anymore, so early game is going up. Nerf to Corrupting Potion no longer scales the damage. Here you go. Very rarely do you have a level 18 Corrupting Potion, to be fair. Also, rarely do you even hit level 18 in a game of League of Legends. So, not that big of a deal regardless, but, it starts meaning something by level 2, 3, 4, etc. So, you are going to have a non-trivial damage drop on this thing. It's the kind of thing where you probably still keep this item. Like, I think it probably isn't changing what gets picked. I'm not sure if there's any champions where they're going to switch their itemization priority. It's hard to say. It's definitely a nerf, but I feel like what this thing already does is so good that you're hard-pressed to find replacements, but maybe I'm wrong. Bunch of ARAM balance changes. That's cool. Buffs and nerfs. More VFX updates with Amumu and Tryndamere and Ziggs getting stuff. That's some cool stuff. Bug fixes. Cool. And then here's these sweet skins. And chromas. And that's the patch. So, let's do us a TLDR. TLDR patch 9.12. Mordekaiser Rework is out. Looks super sick. Rise is getting powered down, I would say, quite a lot. The overload changes are, except for the shield change, power neutral to a slight buff in general, I would say. But the shield being gone obviously means quite a lot. Rune Prison no longer roots until you empower it with Spell Flux. That is a really, really, really big deal, but it does more damage, and you might even rank it second. Spell Flux no longer does damage to other minions, but always bounces, which helps your EQ wave clear. Overall, though, means less wave clear for the champion. Just as an overall statement, it is going to be less wave clear. The one other consideration being, though, that you can always EQ and get the minions down, whereas before you'd have to E, then E, then Q, or get like a dying minion to set up a bounce and then Q. So the wave clear will be more reliable, but it will be lower damage because this isn't going to hit other minions for damage. That is going to be a meaningful difference. Realm Warp now has 3 ranks, which means that the cast range is now flattened to the high range, the cooldown. Overall, this is a buff to Realm Warp. Realm Warp is ultimately stronger. Wave Clear is both nerfed and buffed. It is down in damage per combo, but every EQ will splash under a lot of minions. And again, W can't root until you get E. That is a very big deal. Silas, passive no longer damages minions basically at all. Q, very minor power down. W, heal up. E doesn't shield unless you land the second half of it on a champion or monster. That is going to be hard to do. That is going to be a very, very big deal. This is a huge power down for Silas. Yuumi overall getting slight. This is generally a buff for your average to new Yuumi player. These are basically some power downs to experienced Yuumi players. And then this is a very, very, very small buff to the amount of stats she has. I don't think it's going to be enough to push her out of pro play. She will remain very big in pro, but arguably I would say might go up in win rate because of this. Moderate nerf to Aatrox through the passive cooldown and the R not accepting healing from other people, at least not amping healing from other people. That means a little bit. 1 second off Ash Volley to attack damage on Caitlyn. Slight buffs there. 4 to 2 seconds on Aurelia E is a pretty big deal. The range nerf matters quite a bit as well. This is pretty nice. This is quite nice. This is actually pretty big, I would say, buff to Karma. This is a pretty solid power up. Same for Lulu, where the rank up, or the shield just has 10 more shielding, and the rank up of the mana cost is not as harsh. That's going to be pretty meaningful as well. If you update's kind of nice. Small bug fix here, small nerf here. Very meaningful jungle clear buff to Zac with the 10 more base damage. Corrupting Potion, small nerf shouldn't mean all that much. ARAM balance changes, VFX updates, bug fixes, and 3 new skins. that's the patch. I think it's a good patch. I'll see you next time.